subject is 1939 to 1945, 6 years that changed the world forever.
Okay. You told 6 years that changed the world forever. I think it's true. I have another one. I'd like to say it's kind of a show and tell for me, an elder show and tell. And this is the tell, and this happens to be the show. I know you probably think that's a grapefruit, but actually that's a hunk of plutonium in drag. This is a little less than 14 pounds of plutonium. And that's important because I'll show you later on where it was. Because this was the guts of the bomb that was the fat man that was dropped on Nagasaki. That's about all it was in size, and yet it pretty well destroyed the town with an equivalent explosive power of 23,500 tons of TNT in one blast. Okay. My Time of the Manhattan Project. This is primarily a personal story of a young man who was mysteriously taken out of college and sent off to somewhere he didn't know where it was until finally he went through some gates up at Los Alamos and discovered where he was. I wanted to ask if you thought of two people, any two people who were connected with the Manhattan Project, whom might they be? Who else would you say?
Till?
Harry Truman.
Okay.
Harry Truman, because but the one you don't ordinarily think of is President Roosevelt.
Okay.
Do you know about that? We'll get to that a little later on, but he was very much instrumental in that. Marie Curie, I'm going back to about 1890. She was a chemist working with her husband, and she happened to be working with uranium that had been discovered as an element before that. She was trying to figure out what it would do and what it wouldn't do. And she had made a compound of it. Maybe it was a salt of uranium, not sodium chloride, but maybe it was uranium chloride. That doesn't make any difference. But late in the afternoon, she was finishing up her work. It was time to go home and fix up supper for her husband, presumably. And she took this little sample she had and she put it in the cupboard, closed the door, turned the lights out, and went home. Now, in that cupboard, at the same time, there happened to be some photographic plates that had been unexposed. Now, the photography had come along pretty well. You probably remember seeing the pictures of the big camera and they pulled a big hood over them and they put photographic plates in. Well, when she got back the next morning and opened it up to take her sample out, she had some reason to do something with these photographic plates and she found out they were exposed. Well, this little inert stuff here was exposing that. Well, now, she had been working with Henri Becquerel, who was the father of X-rays, so she immediately thought something's going on here. And she was the one that came up with the name of this, radioactivity. She was the first one that gave it this, I guess. Lord Haverford. He was in England, and he was concerned, interested in how much energy came from this inert substance that would expose photographic plates. And he deduced that it was really a tremendous amount of energy coming from something inert. We're thinking about that. Now, let's go another 10 years up to this guy, Albert Einstein. He'd been working on his relativity and all that, but along the way he came up with this E=mc² equation. I think it's more like a postulate than anything else, which in effect said that energy and matter were the same thing, just in a different form. When I talk to the ladies, I say it's like ice and water. You take ice and you heat it, it'll turn into water. It's the same thing in a different form. Well, you can't do that with ordinary mass with uranium, but you can get it started with a chain reaction, which is what made the whole thing work. And a little bit of M with that great big C². C is actually, it's a constant, but it's the speed of light, 186,000 in some units. You square that, you get up to, I guess, somewhere in the billions. So a little bit of M and a billion number like that gives you E, and that's a very big amount of energy. And in the case of the bomb that I worked on, which was the plutonium and not the uranium, that E came out to be 23,500 tons equivalent of dynamite.
TNT.
TNT, right. Because M was actually very small. Now this is a little less than 14 pounds, but when this was in the center of that bomb, and I'll show you where it fits in there a little while later on, as the chain reaction started and the explosion started, it dissipated this, it broke up the chain reaction and started it, such that only 1.7 pounds of this, not 14, was actually converted back into pure energy. And that 1.7 pounds times that c squared gave that energy. It blew up a couple of cities over there in Japan. To another few years, the early 1930s, that would be the, well, let's see, Leo Szilard, there he is. He was interested in all this. He was one of those famous scientists in the first half of the last century that was relativity and everything else. He began to think about this. My gosh, if you could control this thing and make this uranium give up its energy, you'd have unlimited power. So he talked about it, but didn't think about it. It was now in the spring of 1939. Lisa Meitner was a Jewish lady from Vienna. She was working in Germany for Otto Hahn, who was in charge of one of the big physics laboratories there. And she was messing around with uranium, and somehow or another bombarded it with neutrons and caused it to fission. That's the name she gave it. When it broke apart into two lesser daughter products, she called it fission, and that's how that got started. Now immediately, when this came out, her boss, and she delivered a paper that went around to physicists all around the world, because when somebody discovered something new, they wanted to get credit with it before somebody else did. So it went around the world in a hurry, and one person it went to was Niels Bohr, who was a Dane in Denmark. He was also at least part Jewish. I think one of his grandparents or his parents was Jewish. And he became very concerned that Hitler may have been ahead of everybody else in this, and they might get a weapons first. Now, he was still in Denmark because Hitler hadn't gone in then. But he contacted a couple of his friends back in the United States, expatriates who had moved here from Europe. Leo Szilard was one, and Eugene Wigner was the other. And he said, hey, you guys, excuse me if I paraphrase this a little bit, you guys better get your president. Because if Germany gets this thing developed and makes a bomb out of it, it'll be held to pay for the rest of the world. Well, this letter was written in, so the next one may be the letter. No, just, anyway, this is where they're giving this letter to Albert Einstein, because Wigner and Szilard said Einstein doesn't know us from the hole in the ground, but we got a friend out in Long Island that knows him very well, and that's Albert Einstein, who was vacationing out there. So they went up to Albert and said, you got to get this letter to the president to get him working on this in a hurry. I have a little bit of the letter. Yeah, I'll just read it real short. In the course of the last 4 months, it has been made probable through the work of Joly in France as well as Fermi and Szilard in America that it may be possible to set up nuclear chain reactions in a large mass of uranium. And this new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs. A single bomb of this type carried by boat or exploded in a port might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. Now this was written, I think, in August the 2nd. But Roosevelt didn't get it that soon. It got lost in bureaucracy somewhere, and he didn't get it until after Hitler marched into Poland and started the war a few weeks later. Then he got this letter, and then he became very concerned. He said, is this true? How do I know? So he got a bunch of physicists around the country to get together. He said, you guys, tell me, is this threat real? Is this something we need to worry about? Well, they looked at it and they said, well, Mr. President, it looks like it's a possibility, but we sure don't know how to do it. Now that is what started the Manhattan Project. This was in the fall of 1939. It was originally called the Manhattan District. Called that because up at Columbia University in New York, they had a rather large amount of uranium that they were working with, so this gave them stuff to work with. Now, so Roosevelt got this started. It shows many of the things they had to work on, and around the country. Now, this was still in 1940. How do you do this? All these things were divided up into various laboratories around working on this, and it went on until December of 42 now. We are now in the war a year when Enrico Fermi up at the University of Chicago, he created the first atomic pile and showed that a chain reaction could be controlled. Now that was exciting, and it really got the thing going in a hurry. That was December 42. Roosevelt immediately appointed a young Colonel Leslie Groves to take it over because he knew this had to be something under the control of the Army. And the scientists got together and chose Oppenheimer as the one who would try to get these people together and put it into high gear. Now, so go to the next one, and it shows Oppenheimer and Grove on the left, and now they're on the right. That thing in the middle is Manhattan Project shoulder patch, which I wear. Robert Oppenheimer started gathering these people up at Los Alamos. Now, when he was growing up, he was in Manhattan, and he had spent a couple of summers out at this boys' ranch up in the mountains, the Los Alamos Ranch for Boys. And he thought this would be a great place to sequester these scientists. I love that word, sequester, these days. Anyway, get them in a fence and keep them quiet. And Groves agreed to that. In the meantime, Groves had started building a new facility down at Oak Ridge because there were 5 methods at the start that they figured they could concentrate uranium-235. I won't go into that, but it's all part of uranium. And they quickly got rid of 3 of them, but they had 2, and they required massive amounts of electricity to do it. The centrifuges that we hear about Iran, that's kind of what this is all about. They need a lot of electricity. Oak Ridge was the place because of TVA power. And I think at one time, about 15 to 20% of all the power in the United States is being used right there from TVA for the concentration of uranium. This is where my timeline comes in, because this was in December of '42 that the thing got into high gear. In January 24, it's going to get personal now, I was 18 years old. And that's it, how I got to Los Alamos. I went down on my 18th birthday to volunteer at the draft board. And I wanted to volunteer for the Army. I was afraid that if I were drafted, they might put me in the Navy. And I didn't think I could swim as well as I could dig a foxhole if I got in trouble. Kind of crazy, but that was it. Well, they wanted to know what I was doing. And I said, well, I was at Vanderbilt. I started the previous June when I graduated from high school. I'd gone summer and winter when Henry and I and others were there. And I finished my first year. They said, well, okay, go home, we'll call you in a few days. Well, they did call me a few days and said, okay, you're in the Army, we got our hooks in you, but you haven't been sworn in yet. We want you to go back to school, stay in engineering school with a special deferment. I think it was a 2A deferment at the convenience of the government or something like that. And we'll call you. Well, okay, that wasn't too bad, because my dad had died just a year before. He'd been in the trenches in France in the First World War. And my older brother Daniel was away at school, but he joined the Air Corps. And I was at home, and there were 2 baby brothers. Anyway, this is a pretty good deal. So I stayed home, and it was a year and a half before they called me, in 1944, after D-Day. Now, I had no idea why this was so, but as you look back on it, Leslie Groves, immediately when this thing got kicked into high gear, after Fermi and controlling the reaction, he realized that when these crazy temperamental scientists up at Los Alamos were able to figure out how to do this, they were going to need a bunch of technically trained people to do the grunt work, so to speak. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time. And the draft board, I don't think they had any idea what this was about, but they were looking for kids who were making good grades in any kind of technical training. And so I happened to be at the right place at the right time. I think if I'd tried to, my birthday had been a month earlier, I probably would have been in the Army and missed this entirely. But anyway, I got called, and I had a good time the next year and a half at Vanderbilt. Most of the guys were gone. I was in New York for September of 44 now. We'd already landed at D-Day. This was summer. Now, it was then that they realized they'd been trying to concentrate uranium all this time, a couple of years now, and they still had only enough for what they figured would make 1 bomb. Now, that wasn't enough, because the military had said, if we're going to handle this thing, you got to have at least 3 before we drop the first one. If it doesn't work, that doesn't make any difference. But it does work, and they think maybe we don't have another, we got to show them. So they wanted 3. And if they didn't surrender after the second one, they'd do the third one. And if they hadn't surrendered then, it was our directive to make 7 of those a month. And of course, fortunately, we didn't have to do that.